If anyone had ever told me that I'd be living in a country where the population was prevented from leaving their homes except for maybe 1 hour a day for exercise, or that there was a ban on staying overnight anywhere else other than in your own home, or there was a ban on meeting anybody, even members of your own family, even people who were quite close to you but they lived somewhere else. And if I was also told that I lived in a country where retail outlets, stores, shops would be closed to you so that you couldn't actually go to them by diktat of the government, and if there was a shutting down of sports facilities, gymnasiums, golf courses, all of those kind of things. And if there was also in force a ban on overseas travel, and you couldn't travel by aeroplane anywhere, maybe, couldn't leave the country in actual fact. And if also on top of all of that, you were told that this country exercised a tracking system so that people knew exactly where you were at any particular moment, and they could track down who you'd been with at any particular time. And also, if on top of all of that, there was a massive media campaign that virtually forced people to observe all of these regulations and to instill them with such fear and trepidation that they agreed to all of them and thought them were a good thing, then I'd have thought we were living in a rather strange and unusual Eastern European country behind the Iron Curtain. Strangely enough, in the country in which I live, we've had all of those things, including the requirement to wear face coverings on top of that, despite the lack of any scientific evidence to show their effectiveness. In quite the contrary, according to numbers of research which has been done. And yet, it's a requirement of the state to do so. And the level of control which has been exercised has just been quite astonishing. The lack of ability of people to argue against that has also been equally astonishing. The lack of the fact that there's not really been any opposition, making our country rather like a one-party state, where the opposition is in name only, and where they suggest not only that the government hasn't locked down enough, but should have locked down harder, faster, earlier, further, and still go on and on doing it. If you'd said that I lived in a country like that 18 months ago, I would have said, well, you'd be crazy, because I would be living in somewhere like Eastern European countries in the 60s, run by the Stasi. If you'd have told me that we live in a country where there'd be huge amounts of overreach too, so that people who were walking out in the open air in the Peak District were vilified by the police and told to turn back, that people have been moved on by the police simply for walking in parks, or rather sitting in parks on benches because they weren't properly using the park to exercise in. If we'd seen places where golfers have been prosecuted quite gleefully by councils simply because they were out playing a game when they shouldn't be. And if you'd also seen the protesters of people who were against this quite brutally crushed by police, and similar police who, with other protesters and other demonstrators, maybe of climate change or Black Lives Matter, were quite happy to kneel before the crowd, you'd think that you were living in a world which is completely alien to anything that would be considered reasonable, rational, or even something which you would have any faith or confidence in. And yet, here we are. We find ourselves in such a situation. But I suppose the worst of it is not so much that. The worst of it is that when all of these rules and regulations are released, and when freedom is announced, and when you're allowed to go back to living normally, most people still keep their masks on. Most people still walk around others at 2-meter distances. Most people are still afraid to do what they normally used to do. That, I would say, is a very high level of control. It's the kind of control where you have trained a rat in a cage so much to accommodate themselves to the cage itself that when you leave the door open, they refuse to walk out the door. They prefer the security of the cage to the freedom of the open world. And unfortunately, that's the kind of world that we live in today.